So in recent years, the X-Men have become a global power in Marvel Comics, and in fact, there are mutants that now live on Mars. So for the non-comic book reader, this can be incredibly confusing to try to get into. Especially with Fall of X coming out, a lot of people I think are intrigued and trying to find a way into the X-Men. So we're gonna make sense of all this stuff in this video. So the way that Marvel handled the X-Men in recent years, it's kind of done in like 3 phases. So phase 1 was basically the relaunch. That was House and Powers of X, and that focused on a woman named Moira McTaggart. So for decades in Marvel, Moira was just a mutant geneticist. Now, what Marvel did with House and Powers of X is they actually changed her character up, and they revealed that Moira McTaggart actually has powers, that whenever she dies, the timeline resets. Now, it doesn't reset the whole universe back to its very beginnings. What it does is it resets the timeline back to when she was born. So everything that took place between the time that she was conceived and the time she died all gets reset back to 0. Now, of course, she had no idea this was her power until the first time she died. But when she came back with her second life, she remembered everything from her first life. And that's the way her character worked. When she died the third time, she remembered everything from the first life and the second life. And that keeps going on and on and on. Now, Moira McTaggart has died and reset the timeline and been born again a total of 10 times. And we're on the 10th life right now. This is what's going on in the X-Men comics. The reason why this matters is because over these different lives that Moira McTaggart has had, what she did is she came to the realization somewhere along the line, a war will always break out between the mutant population and the human population. And no matter how this war transpires or who's involved, the mutant population always gets destroyed. And so what she had been trying to do over the course of these different lives was try to find a way to ensure that the mutant population came out on top. In fact, during one of these lives, she developed a cure for the mutant gene to basically eliminate it from humanity and turn mutants into normal humans. Ultimately, she was killed for her efforts and then the timeline reset. But the fact remains, when you got to the 10th life, Moira McTaggart went to visit Charles Xavier. And when they first met, she allowed him to read her mind and to see everything that she'd seen over the course of the different lives that she'd been living. And that's when Xavier realized we have to find a way to keep humanity from eradicating us at some future point in time. And so Xavier met with Magneto, and between Magneto, Xavier, and Moira McTaggart, they decided to basically create their own island nation. And this is when they took up residence on Krakoa. Now, once Krakoa was chosen to be the safe haven of the mutant population, Xavier, Moira McTaggart, and Magneto did 4 things. The first thing they did is they opened the doors of Krakoa to every mutant across the world, whether they had traditionally been a villain or a hero. The fact was they were all mutants, so they were all united. Now, of course, this would lead to rivalries, it would lead to villains fighting heroes, things along those lines. So to solve that problem, the second thing they did is they created the Quiet Council and a set of laws. One of those laws was that mutants could not harm other mutants lest they be confined to what was called the Pit, which was basically just a giant hole in the center of Krakoa where you would remain for eternity. And in fact, that was what happened to Sabretooth for a time. The third thing they did is they developed technologies that could cure any mental illness, schizophrenia, dementia, Alzheimer's, as well as medicines that could extend the lifespan of the average person. The only way these medicines could be attained is if any one particular country chose to recognize the sovereignty of Krakoa and then allow all mutants from their country to leave and travel to Krakoa. But the fourth thing they did is they created what was called resurrection. And what this basically meant was that the mutant population found a way to cheat death, that they had a group that was called the Five. These were 5 different mutants, also known as Omega level mutants, meaning they're some of the most powerful mutants in existence, but between the 5 of them and the powers they had, they could do things like bring Wolverine back from the dead and then use their reality warping powers to create adamantium and bond it to his skeleton. Whenever a mutant was on Krakoa, at all times, their mind was constantly being backed up to a database, so that if a mutant suddenly killed over from a brain aneurysm, they could be resurrected, and all the memories they had up until the moment they died would be put back in their head. What's funny about this is the resurrection protocols actually became a major focus of an event called Judgment Day, which was a war between the Avengers, the X-Men, and the Eternals, but that's neither here nor there. Now, this takes us into what's basically the second phase of the X-Men era, and this was the era of Krakoa, Arakko, and Okara. These 3 things genuinely confuse people, so I will make it all make sense. What Marvel tells us is that at some point in the distant past of Earth, running up to about 5 to 10,000 years ago, there was a giant landmass that was called Okara. Now, the reason why I say 5 to 10,000 years ago is because during that time period, Apocalypse, one of the oldest mutants in existence, alongside his wife Genesis, had basically turned Okara into a giant safe haven where all mutants resided. The kicker about all this is that about 5 to 10,000 years ago, someone used the Twilight Sword of Surtur and cut a literal rift in the very fabric of reality at Okara, which allowed all these different demonic beings from another dimension to come pouring into Earth. And so Apocalypse and his wife Genesis rallied all the mutants across the world at that point in time and launched an attack to try to counter the invading forces. But during this war, what Apocalypse and his wife started to realize is the only way for this conflict to end was for someone or a group of people to go to the other side of the rift and to seal it shut. And that's what Apocalypse's wife Genesis and most mutants on Earth at that time did. And so Apocalypse was really the only mutant left on Earth. There were a few, but for the most part, he was the only one. Now, when the forces of Genesis transitioned from Earth into this other dimension and they sealed the breach, it cut Okara in half. The half of Okara that stayed on Earth became Krakoa. The other half that stayed in the dimension was renamed to Arakko. Now, the reason why all of this is so important and why we're even covering it is because during the time in which Genesis and her forces were confined to Arakko, they were basically waging a never-ending war against these demonic forces. And so that meant the life they knew was just war and chaos. Now, the benefit of this is they constantly grew more powerful, and that's why the mutants within Arakko were so incredibly powerful in comparison to the mutants on Earth. Now, during the events of Ten of Swords, it was a great big huge tournament, more or less, but mutants from Arakko were brought to Earth and then a giant event ensued. At the end of that, the breach was temporarily unsealed, and those mutants from Arakko who wanted to leave and come to Earth were allowed to do so. Once that decision had been made, and once all the mutants who wanted to leave Arakko did leave Arakko, the breach was resealed again. Now, the biggest problem you had here is that most all mutants who lived in Krakoa were essentially peaceful. They didn't really chase conflict and war if they didn't have to, but the mutants from Arakko knew nothing but war, and so that meant that these two groups could not coexist. So what ended up happening is that the mutants from Arakko who initially went to Krakoa left, and they basically took up residence on Mars and then renamed Mars to New Arakko, or just Arakko. So that's why you have mutants on Mars right now. Now, the big thing that came out of like the third phase was the revelation of Moira McTaggart, that where she had initially met with Xavier and initially met with Magneto and pitched herself as this person that was just trying to find a way to save the mutant population. What she was trying to do was eliminate the mutant population, because over the course of her lives, she'd come to the realization there was no way for the mutant population to win. Nothing that could be done would save the mutant population from complete and utter destruction. The only way to get around that was by virtue of basically inventing the resurrection process. And that what would happen over however many years before that event took place is that if 1,000 mutants died over the course of a year, 1,000 mutants would be resurrected. But one of those mutants would be resurrected without their powers. But because only mutants are allowed on the nation of Krakoa, that mutant that came back with no powers would be sent away. And that was the goal of Moira McTaggart, to slowly eliminate the mutant gene over time as different mutants were being resurrected, and basically reduce the number of mutants on Earth, turning all those different mutants into humans. The war between the mutant population and the human population cannot take place if there are no mutants. That took place in a story called Inferno, and that basically brought an end to the run of Jonathan Hickman. Truth to tell, ever since then, Marvel's just kind of been killing time. So having said all that, if you guys are wanting to get caught up with everything related to the X-Men, including the things that we did talk about here, as well as the things that we didn't, make sure you click this link to our X-Men playlist. It'll have everything that you want to know. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button and make sure you subscribe to become part of the channel, and I will catch you all later. Peace.